The waves crashed against the steel hull of the landing craft with a violence that matched the churning stomachs of the young soldiers huddled inside. Private James Mitchell pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his rifle clutched tight against his chest as the vessel pitched and rolled through the dark waters of the English Channel. It was June 6, 1944, and the largest seaborne invasion in human history was about to unfold. For months, the Allied forces had been preparing for this moment. Operation Overlord, as it was codenamed, represented the culmination of years of planning, deception, and desperate hope. The fate of Western Europe hung in the balance, and every man aboard those thousands of ships knew that by dawn, many of them would never see another sunrise. General Dwight David Eisenhower had made the most difficult decision of his military career just hours earlier. The weather had been atrocious for days, with storms lashing the English coast and making any amphibious assault seem like suicide. His meteorologists had given him a brief window of opportunity, a slight break-in, the weather that might, just might, allow the invasion to proceed. The alternative was to wait another month, risking discovery by German forces and the potential collapse of Allied morale. In the pre-dawn darkness of Normandy, the German defenders had no idea that 156,000 Allied troops were approaching their shores. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's supposedly impregnable coastal fortification system, stretched along the French coast like a concrete serpent, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. These defenses represented the Nazi regime's last hope of preventing an Allied foothold in Western Europe. The deception campaign, Operation Fortitude, had worked brilliantly. German intelligence remained convinced that the main Allied assault would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. General George Smith Patton Jr.'s fictitious 1st United States Army Group had been positioned in southeastern England, complete with inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic, to maintain this illusion. Meanwhile, the real invasion force had assembled in ports along England's southern coast, hidden from German reconnaissance by an elaborate web of counterintelligence operations, as reported by military historians in the Smithsonian magazines. Comprehensive analysis of D-Day preparations. The logistical challenges of mounting such an operation were staggering. The Allied forces had assembled over 5,000 ships and landing craft, supported by 11,000 aircraft. The invasion would involve troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, Norway, France, and numerous other Allied nations, each bringing their own equipment, tactics, and determination to the fight. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already begun their descent into occupied France, scattered by anti-aircraft fire and fierce winds across the Norman countryside. Their mission was to secure key bridges and crossroads, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches, where the main assault would begin at dawn. In the landing craft, soldiers checked their equipment one final time. Some prayed silently, others wrote final letters to loved ones, and many simply stared into the darkness, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what lay ahead. The diesel engines thrummed beneath their feet, carrying them inexorably toward a destiny that would reshape the world. The liberation of Western Europe was about to begin, but first, these young men would have to survive the most heavily defended coastline in military history. The roar of aircraft engines filled the night sky over Normandy as 13,000 Allied paratroopers prepared to spearhead the greatest military operation in history. Major Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, checked his watch in the cramped interior of the Douglas C-47 transport plane. It was 20 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, and the airborne assault that would precede the beach landings was about to commence. The plan called for 3 airborne divisions to drop behind enemy lines in the hours before dawn. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would secure the western flank of the invasion area, while the British 6th Airborne Division would protect the eastern approaches. Their objectives were critical: capture key bridges, destroy German communications, and prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the beaches where the main invasion force would land at first light. As the transport planes crossed the channel, they encountered something no amount of training had prepared them for: a wall of clouds and fierce winds that scattered the tight formations like leaves in a hurricane. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from German positions below, sending streams of tracer bullets through the darkness. Many pilots, disoriented by the weather and ground fire, dropped their paratroopers far from their intended targets. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole found himself leading his battalion through the flooded fields of the Cotentin Peninsula, miles from where they were supposed to land. The Germans had deliberately flooded large areas behind Utah Beach, turning what should have been solid ground into treacherous marshland. Paratroopers weighted down with equipment found themselves struggling through waist-deep water, vulnerable to enemy fire and drowning. Despite the chaos, small groups of American paratroopers began achieving their objectives through individual initiative and desperate courage. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers single-handedly cleared a German strong point near the village of St. Mary-Église, while scattered elements of the 101st Airborne seized crucial causeways leading inland. From Utah Beach, the British airborne forces faced their own challenges on the eastern flank of the invasion area. Major John Howard's glider-borne troops executed one of the most daring operations of the entire invasion, landing within yards of the Pegasus Bridge over the Caen Canal. In a landing assault lasting mere minutes, they overwhelmed the German guards and secured this vital crossing, preventing German armor from reaching the British landing beaches. The sound of the airborne assault reached German commanders throughout Normandy, but the scattered nature of the drops initially confused rather than alarmed them. Many German officers dismissed the paratroop landings as diversionary raids, rather than the opening phase of a major invasion. This confusion was exactly what Allied planners had hoped for. The element of surprise remained intact for the seaborne assault still hours away. As dawn approached, the paratroopers who had survived the night began consolidating their positions. They had paid a terrible price for their objectives. Many units had suffered casualties exceeding 50%, but they had succeeded in creating chaos behind German lines. Road networks were disrupted, communications cut, and German commanders found themselves fighting isolated battles across the Norman countryside, instead of coordinating a unified defense. According to detailed accounts preserved in the National World War II Museum archives, the airborne operations demonstrated both the courage of individual soldiers and the importance of adaptability in military planning. When carefully laid plans dissolved in the face of enemy action and adverse weather, these young men improvised and overcame through sheer determination and training that had prepared them for exactly such chaos. The paratroopers had lit the fuse of liberation. Now, as the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the English Channel, it was time for the main event. The largest seaborne invasion in human history was about to crash upon the shores of Nazi-occupied Europe. The first light of June 6, 1944, revealed a sight that would have seemed impossible just years before. The English Channel transformed into a highway of liberation, stretching from horizon to horizon with Allied warships, transports, and landing craft. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay's naval armada represented the largest seaborne invasion force ever assembled, carrying the hopes of the free world toward the heavily fortified shores of Normandy. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, the naval bombardment began. The battleships United States ship Texas, His Majesty's ship Warspite, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers opened fire on German coastal fortifications with a thunder that could be heard 20 miles inland. For 40 minutes, shells weighing as much as small automobiles crashed into concrete bunkers, barbed wire entanglements, and artillery positions along the Atlantic Wall. The bombardment was so intense that German defenders reported feeling the earth shake beneath their feet like an earthquake. Colonel James Earl Rudder watched from his landing craft as the cliffs of Point du Hoc emerged from the morning mist. His 2nd Ranger Battalion had drawn one of the most dangerous assignments of the entire invasion. Scale the 100-foot cliffs under enemy fire and destroy a battery of German guns that could devastate the landings. At Omaha Beach, the Rangers had trained for months on similar cliffs along the English coast, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of climbing rope ladders. While German soldiers dropped grenades from above, the landing craft carrying the Rangers approached the base of the cliffs. At exactly 700 hours, German machine guns immediately opened fire from positions carved into the cliff face, sending bullets ricocheting off the water around the small boats. Despite taking casualties before they even reached shore, the Rangers began their ascent using rocket-fired grappling hooks and rope ladders, each man carrying 40 pounds of equipment on his back. Meanwhile, 5 miles to the east, the first wave of infantry was approaching Omaha Beach's stretch of sand that would soon earn the nickname Bloody Omaha. The 4,000 Allied troops assigned to this beach faced the strongest German defenses in the entire invasion area. The 35th Infantry Division held positions in concrete bunkers and trenches that provided overlapping fields of fire. Across every yard of sand, Captain John Robert Slaughter of the 116th Infantry Regiment felt his stomach lurch as his landing craft approached the shoreline. The naval bombardment had failed to destroy the German positions, and machine gun fire was already raking the water around the approaching boats. When the ramp dropped, Slaughter led his men into chest-deep water under withering fire from positions they could barely see. The scene that unfolded on Omaha Beach defied every carefully laid plan. Landing craft carrying tanks and artillery sank in the rough surf, leaving the infantry without the heavy weapons support they desperately needed. Communications broke down as radio equipment was destroyed by gunfire or soaked by seawater. Units became separated in the chaos, with officers and non-commissioned officers killed or wounded within minutes of landing. Sergeant First Class Philip Stretchick found himself pinned down behind a seawall, with the remnants of his platoon, German bullets, passing inches over their heads. Dead and wounded soldiers lay scattered across the sand behind them, testament to the deadly accuracy of the German defensive fire. For nearly 2 hours, it appeared that the landing at Omaha Beach might fail completely. The turning point came when small groups of soldiers, acting without orders from their commanders, began individual assaults on German positions. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives, were used to blow gaps in the barbed wire. Engineers under fire cleared paths through minefields. Slowly, painfully, the American infantry began to fight their way off the beach and up the bluffs beyond. As documented in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive research for D-Day, June 6, 1944, the success at Omaha Beach came not from grand strategy, but from the courage of individual soldiers who refused to accept defeat. By noon, the first American troops had penetrated inland, though at a cost that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe had been purchased with blood, but it held. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, while American forces fought desperately for their lives on Omaha Beach. British and Canadian troops were writing their own chapter of D-Day heroism on the beaches. Codenamed Gold and Juno, the 21st Army Group under General Sir Bernard Law Montgomery had trained for this moment through 2 years of intensive preparation, and their assault demonstrated the tactical lessons learned from earlier amphibious operations in North Africa and Italy. At Gold Beach, the 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division approached the Norman coast with a confidence born of experience. These were veteran troops who had fought at El Alamein and through the Italian campaign. Their landing craft carried not just infantry, but specially modified tanks known as Hobart's Funnies, engineering vehicles designed to overcome the specific obstacles of beach warfare. Major Anthony Blyth led his company of the Green Howards ashore at exactly 7:25 in the morning, following closely behind swimming Sherman tanks that had been launched from landing craft 2 miles offshore. The duplex drive tanks, equipped with collapsible canvas screens and propellers, provided crucial fire support as the infantry fought their way across the sand. German resistance was fierce, but not as well coordinated as at Omaha, and within 2 hours, British forces had secured their initial objectives. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division faced their own trial by fire at Juno Beach, where the German 356th Infantry Division had prepared defensive positions among the seaside villages of Courseulles-sur-Mer and Bernières-sur-Mer. Major Jim Ralston of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada watched his men wade through the surf under machine gun fire, many carrying bicycles they would use to pursue retreating Germans once the beach was secured. The Canadians brought a particular intensity to their assault, driven by years of waiting for the chance to return to continental Europe. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles and the Regina Rifle Regiment fought house to house through the coastal villages, clearing German strongpoints with grenades and bayonets. Their advance was so rapid that by noon, Canadian forces had penetrated further inland than any other Allied unit on D-Day. At Sword Beach, the easternmost of the landing sites, British forces faced a unique challenge. The German 21st Panzer Division was positioned just inland from the beach, ready to launch immediate counterattacks against any landing force. The 1st Battalion, South Lancashire Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Maurice Burberry, landed directly into this hornet's nest of German armor and infantry. The battle for Sword Beach quickly evolved into the kind of mobile warfare that would characterize the Normandy campaign. British forces pushed inland supported by Churchill tanks and self-propelled artillery, while German panzers attempted to drive them back into the sea. The village of Wistrihan changed hands 3 times during the morning, as both sides committed their reserves to the struggle. One of the most remarkable individual actions of the day occurred when Captain Lord Lovett led his commando brigade inland from Sword Beach to link up with the airborne forces at Pegasus Bridge. Lovett, accompanied by his personal piper, who played traditional Scottish airs throughout the advance, led his men on a forced march through German-held territory that demonstrated the audacity and confidence of elite British forces. The success of the British and Canadian landings owed much to superior planning and the integration of specialized equipment. Unlike the Americans at Omaha, who had declined the use of many British-designed beach assault vehicles, the Commonwealth forces employed flail tanks to clear minefields, batod tanks to destroy concrete obstacles, and bridge-laying tanks to cross anti-tank ditches. By evening, all three Commonwealth beaches had been secured and consolidated. The port of Romanches had been captured, where British engineers would soon begin constructing one of the artificial harbors that would supply the invasion force. The village of Bale was within reach, and Canadian forces were approaching the outskirts of Caen, though that ancient city would not fall for another month. As reported in the detailed operational histories compiled by the Imperial War Museum, the British and Canadian performance on D-Day validated years of careful preparation and tactical innovation. Their success provided the stable northern flank that allowed American forces to begin their breakout from the Normandy beachhead. The Commonwealth charge had succeeded brilliantly, setting the stage for the liberation of northwestern Europe. At the westernmost edge of the invasion front, Utah Beach presented a stark contrast to the carnage unfolding at Omaha. The 4th Infantry Division, led by Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, and at 57, the oldest man to land on D-Day, faced lighter German resistance. But navigating through flooded terrain that threatened to bog down the entire operation, Roosevelt, walking with a cane due to arthritis and a heart condition that would kill him within weeks, had personally requested permission to accompany the first wave of his division's assault. His presence on the beach, calmly directing traffic and encouraging his men under sporadic German fire, became one of the most inspiring leadership examples of the entire invasion. When asked about the dangers, Roosevelt had told his superiors, "The troops will follow me because I'm the oldest man on the beach, and they'll know I wouldn't ask them to do anything I wouldn't do myself." The landing at Utah Beach began at 6:30 in the morning, when the first wave of infantry hit the wrong section of coastline. Navigational error. That proved to be a stroke of luck. The troops landed nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended target, in an area where German defenses were lighter and the approaches inland were more suitable for rapid advance. When junior officers reported the mistake to Roosevelt, he made an instant decision that shaped the entire day. "We'll start the war from right here." The 8th Infantry Regiment, supported by swimming Sherman tanks, quickly overcame the scattered German resistance on the beach itself. The real challenge lay in the causeways leading inland through the flooded areas behind the dunes. German engineers had deliberately breached the seawalls, creating vast marshes that channeled any advancing force into predictable killing zones, covered by artillery and machine gun fire. This was where the connection with the airborne forces became crucial. Throughout the night, scattered elements of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had been fighting to secure these exact causeways. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers had already become a legend by single-handedly clearing German positions near St. Mary-Église, while other paratroopers fought desperate battles for control of bridges and crossroads throughout the Cotentin Peninsula. The link-up between the beach and airborne forces began around noon, when elements of the 406th Infantry Regiment made contact with paratroopers of the 500th at 1st Parachute Infantry Regiment near the village of Poopville. The meeting was almost anticlimactic. A group of muddy, exhausted paratroopers emerging from a hedgerow to greet equally tired infantry advancing from the beach. But this simple handshake represented the success of one of the most complex military operations ever attempted. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole's battalion had fought all night to secure exit 4, one of the vital causeways leading from Utah Beach. His paratroopers, scattered and under strength, had improvised their way through German defenses using tactics learned in training but adapted to the reality of combat. When Cole finally made radio contact with the beach forces, his laconic message summed up the entire airborne effort. "Mission accomplished. We're still here." The German response to the Utah Beach landing was hampered by the same confusion that affected their reaction to the airborne drops. The scattered nature of the paratrooper landings had created dozens of small battles throughout the area, preventing German commanders from forming a clear picture of Allied intentions. Reserve units that might have been concentrated against the beach landings were instead dispersed, fighting isolated actions against small groups of paratroopers. By evening, the 4th Infantry Division had achieved all its D-Day objectives and was preparing to advance inland toward Cherbourg, the major port that was essential to sustaining the invasion. The connection with the airborne forces was secure, and the western flank of the invasion was firmly established. The cost had been remarkably light, fewer than 200 casualties, compared to the thousands lost at Omaha Beach. As documented in military historian Gordon Harrison's official history, cross-channel attack, the success at Utah Beach demonstrated the importance of adaptability and aggressive leadership at the tactical level. Roosevelt's decision to advance from the wrong landing site, rather than attempting to correct the error, saved countless lives and achieved objectives ahead of schedule. His posthumous Medal of Honor citation would read simply, "He was the first man ashore and the last to leave." The western anchor of the invasion was secure. Now the race was on to expand the beachhead. Before German reserves could mount an effective counterattack, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel stood in his study at La Roche-Guyon, staring at the map of Normandy with growing dismay. It was 7 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, and reports were flooding in from all along the Atlantic Wall. The Allied invasion he had long predicted was finally underway, but he was hundreds of miles away from the battle, having traveled to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and plead with Hitler for additional panzer reserves. The German response to D-Day was hampered from the very beginning by a command structure that Hitler had deliberately designed to prevent any general from accumulating too much power. 3 different commanders had authority over various aspects of the Normandy defenses. Rommel controlled Army Group B and the coastal fortifications. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commanded all Western forces as head of Army Group West, and Hitler himself retained personal control over the panzer reserves through his headquarters staff. At the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, the Führer was still asleep when the first reports of the invasion reached his staff at 4 o'clock in the morning. None of his subordinates dared wake him, believing the landings might be a diversion for the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. This fatal delay meant that the German armored reserves remained immobilized during the crucial first hours when they might have driven the Allied forces back into the sea. Colonel General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army responsible for defending Normandy, found himself fighting a battle he had never expected to face. His fixed defenses along the coast were being overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Allied firepower, while his mobile reserves were scattered across the peninsula dealing with airborne landings. The elaborate plans for coordinated counterattacks dissolved in the face of Allied air superiority and the confusion created by the scattered paratrooper drops. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed near Caen and the closest armored unit to the invasion beaches, finally received orders to attack at noon, 6 hours after the landings began. By then, British forces from Sword Beach had already established a foothold several miles inland. When the German tanks finally advanced, they found themselves attacking uphill against entrenched infantry supported by naval gunfire that could destroy a panzer from 15 miles away. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion of the 21st Panzer Division, led one of the few successful German counterattacks of the day. His forces broke through British lines and actually reached the coast between Juno and Sword Beaches, temporarily splitting the invasion front. But without infantry support or supplies, his isolated tanks were forced to withdraw after a few hours, and the gap was quickly sealed by British reserves, the German Air Force. The once mighty Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war could muster only 300 aircraft against the invasion compared to nearly 12,000 Allied planes that controlled the skies over Normandy. German pilots reported that attempting to attack the invasion fleet was like flying into a wall of steel, as Allied fighters and anti-aircraft fire created an impenetrable barrier over the beaches. Admiral Theodor Krank, commanding German naval forces in the West, faced an equally hopeless situation. His fleet consisted of a handful of destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines totally inadequate against the thousands of Allied vessels crowding the channel. German naval attacks were limited to scattered torpedo boat raids and the launching of a few submarines, none of which significantly impacted the invasion. By evening, when Hitler finally authorized the release of additional panzer reserves, It was delayed to prevent the Allies from establishing their foothold. The 12th Panzer Division and Panzerlehr Division were ordered to march toward Normandy, but Allied air attacks turned the journey into a nightmare of burning vehicles and blocked roads. Units that should have reached the battlefield in hours took days to arrive, and many never made it at all. The German intelligence failure was perhaps even more critical than the command confusion. Despite warnings from some field commanders, German high command remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion. The fictitious Allied army group under General Patton, positioned in southeastern England, continued to fool German intelligence even after the real invasion had begun. Significant German reserves remained in the Pas-de-Calais area for weeks, waiting for an attack that would never come. As detailed in historian David Irving's controversial but meticulously researched Hitler's War, the German response to D-Day revealed the fundamental weaknesses that would doom the Third Reich, a command structure based on personal loyalty rather than military efficiency, strategic reserves held back by political considerations, and intelligence failures rooted in wishful thinking, all combined to hand the Allies their greatest victory. Rommel's Atlantic Wall had been breached, and there was no reserve position strong enough to stop the flood of Allied forces now pouring into Fortress Europe. As the sun set over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the impossible had become reality. 156,000 Allied troops had successfully landed on the heavily fortified coast of Nazi-occupied Europe, establishing a foothold that would never be relinquished. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, but the cost of this momentous achievement was written in blood across the Norman beaches. General Dwight David Eisenhower stood in his headquarters at Southwick House, reviewing the initial casualty reports with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The overall Allied losses, approximately 10,000 casualties, including 4,000 confirmed dead, were actually lower than the most pessimistic pre-invasion estimates. But behind these statistics lay individual tragedies. The 19-year-old private from Iowa who drowned in the surf at Omaha Beach, the British paratrooper who died defending Pegasus Bridge, the Canadian sergeant who fell clearing bunkers at Juno Beach. At Omaha Beach, Sergeant First Class Philip Stretchick finally allowed himself to rest. As darkness fell over the bluffs his unit had fought so desperately to capture, the beach that had seemed like a death trap at dawn was now secure, with supplies flowing ashore and reinforcements moving inland. But the price had been terrible. Some companies had suffered casualty rates exceeding 70%, and the sand was still stained red with the blood of young men who had given everything for freedom. The Rangers at Point du Hoc had achieved their objective, scaling the cliffs under fire and destroying what they believed to be German artillery positions. Only later would they discover that the concrete casements contained wooden dummy guns. The real artillery had been moved inland weeks before, but their attack had drawn German defenders away from the main beaches, contributing to the overall success of the invasion even as 2/3 of the Ranger force became casualties. Colonel James Earl Rudder, wounded but still commanding his decimated battalion, radioed back to headquarters with characteristic understatement. Located, attacked, took, and destroyed objectives. Casualties high. Need reinforcements. Of the 225 Rangers who had started the assault, only 90 were still capable of fighting. Their sacrifice epitomized the courage that made D-Day possible. British and Canadian forces had achieved the most complete success of the day, securing all their primary objectives and advancing several miles inland. The artificial harbor at Romanches was already under construction, while Canadian forces were approaching the outskirts of Caen. The 21st Panzer Division's counterattack had been repulsed, and German reserves were to scattered and delayed to prevent the establishment of a permanent beachhead. In the villages of Normandy, French civilians emerged from cellars and hiding places to witness the beginning of their liberation. 4 years of Nazi occupation were ending, though many would pay a terrible price as the battle for Normandy continued through the summer. The sight of Allied soldiers advancing through their streets brought tears of joy and relief, even as the sound of gunfire reminded everyone that freedom's price was still being paid. The strategic implications of D-Day's success were immediately apparent to military leaders on both sides. Hitler's Fortress Europe had been breached, and Germany now faced the nightmare scenario of a true two-front war. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, while Allied armies established themselves in the west. The Third Reich's doom was sealed, though 8 more months of fighting would be required to achieve final victory. For the individual soldiers who had survived June 6th, the day marked not an ending but a beginning, Ahead lay more months of brutal fighting in the Norman hedgerows, the breakout into open country, the liberation of Paris, and the final drive into Germany itself. Many would not survive to see victory, but all had played their part in freedom's greatest hour, as documented in the comprehensive official histories produced by military historians. From all allied nations, D-Day succeeded because ordinary men performed extraordinary acts of courage when their nations and the cause of freedom demanded it. From the paratroopers who jumped into the unknown darkness to the infantry who charged across open beaches into machine gun fire. From the sailors who navigated through rough seas to the pilots who flew countless sorties over the battlefield. Each played an essential role in the victory. The young American private who had trembled in his landing craft 12 hours earlier now stood guard over German prisoners, his rifle steady and his purpose clear. He had helped write one of history's greatest chapters, though he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand exactly what he and his comrades had accomplished on that longest day. The bold Allied invasion had indeed changed World War II, opening the path to victory and demonstrating that tyranny, no matter how powerful, could not stand against the united determination of free peoples fighting for justice. The beaches of Normandy would forever be hallowed ground, where the tide of history turned and freedom's dawn broke over a world desperate for liberation.